What I'm going to do is talk about a roadmap to zero. How do we get to zero by 2050, and go over some of the work that's going on in the United States and in other places that we know about. I need to give you a little bit of a history so you see where we've come from in a very, very short period of time. In 2012, no one even knew a building sector existed. We were all talking about the automobile sector and transportation and SUVs and emissions, and all the focus was on the transportation sector. And discovered that there was a building sector, and lo and behold, it was responsible for almost 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and globally it was about 40%. And so we published that in a magazine with a very provocative cover called Architects Pollute. Now you got to know, architects think they do the greatest, they do environments for people and make people's lives better. But so this was very provocative and stirred up a whole lot of stuff.
Is your mic? Is the microphone on? Yes. Oh.
Can you all hear me? Yes, good. So that was October 2003. You saw the little butterfly, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in 2006, we formed an organization called Architecture 2030. We formalized it, and we issued the 2030 Challenge, and that was for all new buildings in the U.S. and globally to get to carbon neutral or zero net energy by 2030. If you're going to design a new building for each building type, then your budget is zero in 2030. We started off with a 50% reduction in 2006, and then in increments getting to zero. It was immediately adopted by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and our largest professional organization, which is 85,000 architects, the American Institute of Architects. And so in 2006, 1 month later, they adopted it, and we started moving on it. I want to put into play what's happened since that time, from not even knowing a building sector existed to basically not being able to pick up a magazine or anything and not talk about the building sector and emissions and what's going on. And a few years ago, we couldn't even talk about zero. And now all the conferences in the U.S. are talking about getting to zero. How are we going to get to zero by 2030 and now by 2050 for the entire built environment? And now we're here in Bonn discussing this issue. So Ecofis and a group, Climate Analytics, gave a press conference just a few days ago. And the IPCC ran these, aggregated all the runs into 4 scenarios, but they left out in the report the 5th scenario, and this was presented in a press conference a few days ago. The 5th scenario, we call it the better 85% chance of staying under 2 degrees centigrade or better. So a high probability of staying under 2 degrees centigrade. The 2.6 scenario, which is the only other scenario that gives you a chance to stay under 2 degrees centigrade, is only a 66% chance. So what the scientists said is a 33% chance of going over. We're going to do all this work and we still have a 33% chance of going over. We really need to go to this 85% chance. And that's peaking emissions right after the summit in Paris, and then phasing out all CO2 emissions in the built environment, in the power sector and the industrial sector, by about 2050. So that's how this target of 2050 came along. Those are the 4 other scenarios, and the 2.6 gives you still a 33% chance of going over 2 degrees centigrade. And this is the scenario we all really need to follow, which is the better than 85% chance. So a really high probability of staying under 2 degrees centigrade. So we have an opportunity, a huge opportunity that presents itself today. And that is that the urban environment is responsible for 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So if we get a handle on the urban built environment, we have a chance of meeting those targets. And the good news is that by 2030, 80 billion square meters will be built new and tear down and rebuild in urban environments worldwide, globally. So this is just urban environments. To give you an idea of what that is, that's an area equal to 60% of the entire built environment in the world. That's what 80 billion square meters is. It's a huge amount of building that's going to go on over this period of time. So it's an opportunity, or it will lock us in, if we don't do it right, it will lock us into an emissions pattern for the next 80 to 100 years. Buildings have a lifespan of 80 years on average, and infrastructure 120 years. So if we don't get it right, then there'll be no way to meet even the 2.6 scenario. So where's all the building going to take place? In Western Europe, 4% of that 80 billion, over 80 billion square meters. Other developed countries, another 4%. Middle East and Africa, 9%. Latin America, 9%. India will be 9% all by itself. Other emerging economies, mostly in Southeast Asia, will be 12%. The United States and Canada, North America, will be responsible for 15% of total emissions, and you're all waiting for China. I know Mr. Gao is sitting right here. That is 38% of all of that 80 billion square meters of construction.
We'll explain a little bit.
He will explain this later.
I have more than 5 minutes. I hope in 5 minutes I can explain.
But quite a bit of construction will be going on in China, and it's going on right now in China, obviously. But the interesting news is that 53% of all construction is projected to take place over the next decade and a half, 2 decades in China and North America. So I can now speak to the North American side of things, and Mr. Gao can inform us on the Chinese side of things. But have we made progress in the U.S.? We were at 40 quads of energy. You only have to know that that's energy consumption in 2005. That's how much the building sector in the U.S. used in 2005, 40 quads of energy. And the projection in 2005 from our Energy Information Administration was that we would, by 2030, need over 57, 58 quads of energy. So the line was steep on how much energy we would need. Well, all of a sudden we flattened out to 2007, and then they projected again how much we would need, and it went up, but it was down somewhat. So our building sector got more efficient in 2007. Then we had the recession in 2008, and we had a drop in energy consumption, and then we were projected to go up, but not as steeply. So half of that reduction is due to the recession, not as much building, and the other half is due to efficiency gains. Now the recession is built into the EIA models. So now we have the recession built in. And all of a sudden something happened. We went flat, and then the projections came way down. These are all due to efficiency gains in the building sector. We're designing better buildings, we're building better buildings, the building codes are kicking in. In 2013, we actually went down. Even though we added 20 billion square feet to our building sector, our emissions on the whole building sector, even though it was increasing, it was going down. And then the projections was somewhat flat. And then in 2014, they just released the latest 2014. We're down again, and we're now flat all the way out, even though we're projected to add billions of square feet to, even with all the projections now, of all that 15% of total building construction. We've already peaked in the U.S. So we're down 16.8 quads, the equivalent of 620, 500 megawatt huge power plants. We've saved the American consumer to date about $560 billion of what they would have spent on, were projected to spend on energy, to what now they're not spending, and they have money in their pockets to send their kids to school, buy food, housing. And we're expected to save the U.S. consumer $4.61 trillion from now until 2030 in terms of what they would have spent. And they projected that if we just include the best available demand technologies in our buildings, we would then reduce consumption even further. This is what we have off the shelf in the US, and we'd save another almost $2 trillion in energy costs for consumers. Again, that's money that goes back into the economy. So how did all that happen? It didn't just happen by osmosis, because we said, oh, let's get to zero, or let's move in that direction. But getting to zero is a two-step process. Step one is information. Step two is technology. Information gets us 70 to 80% of the reduction in buildings, and that's through design. That's everything from how you lay out buildings in cities, transportation corridors, walkable communities, all the way down to buildings and building elements, how we design them. You can design out 70 to 80% of the energy consumption of what a typical building uses in a new building or in a major renovation at no cost, low cost. In many cases, it's no cost. And then, obviously, you're going to need some energy to run the buildings, and that's anything from site-scale solar to utility-scale renewables and other non-CO2 emitting energy. So, when we issued the targets in 2006, what happened? Since then, 73% of the top 30 AE firms, which are multinational firms which practice all over the world, have adopted the targets and are beginning to implement them in the United States. And that's ERUP, HOK, ZGF, the DLR Group, Gensler. These are the largest firms in the world that do work all over, but they're implementing those targets right now in the United States. And 52% of all architecture firms in the United States have adopted the targets and are beginning to implement them. Getting to zero. Every major professional organization in North America has adopted the targets. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, National Association of Counties, the governors have adopted the targets. The federal government has put the targets into law for all new federal buildings. All new federal buildings and major renovations must phase out carbon in their new building designs by 2030, and the president has just reconfirmed that and moved the date up to 2020. Issued an executive order, and we have many other states and cities around the U.S. that are adopting the targets to get the carbon neutral in new buildings and renovations by 2030. The state of California is doing one better. You will not be able to build a new residential building in California in 2020 without it being zero net energy, and all commercial buildings by code will need to be zero net energy by 2030. Our National Building Energy Code standard is now 50% below the average for each building type, and it's getting tighter. The president wants to go another 8.5% less on the national code standards. And we're training our architects all across North America. In 27 markets, we have a professional education series that runs every year. We've been running it now for 5 years, and we've trained literally thousands of architects to meet the 2030 targets. We're just setting up an Urbanism Plus 2030 for the planners so that they can plan low-carbon cities and developments. But we have an information gap. What's happening in one place is not happening everywhere, and a lot of this is news to people. So we need to bridge the gap globally and get the information out on how to design the carbon neutral buildings. So at Architecture 2030, we just put online just recently what we call the 2030 palette, and it's all the elements, action items that you need, from large planning scale issues to buildings and building elements, all tied together because it's all part of the built environment and it's all online. And we just applied for a grant to actually do a China palette. We haven't started it yet, but we want to talk to Mr. Gao and others in China on collaborating on that. And so these are some of the elements, to finish up, these are some of the elements that you'll see in the palette. It is a visual language, because that is the only language that is universal. If you want to bridge the gap, it has to be visual. It can't be in one language and then the other language, the other language. So it's everything from living shorelines, how do you map for sea level rise, urban infill, heat island mitigation, down to transit developments, guidelines for transit developments. Actually, China's doing quite a bit of work on that. All the way down to the building scale, building elements, passive heating and cooling systems, everything that doesn't use energy. This is the 70 to 80% reduction is right here. And we're adding new ones as we go along. So we just issued the framework. And so to finish up with the roadmap, how do we get in Paris, how do we get to zero carbon in the building sector? So if we talk about just the building sector, how do we get to zero? We've created the roadmap called Roadmap 2050, and we've set what need to be flexible country targets and then action items to meet those targets. And the action items would be obviously new buildings and existing buildings. So let's just show the country targets first. If in 2015 some kind of agreement is signed for the building sector, and that's the CO2 level by country for the building sector, what we say is we go out to 2050 and 2055, that by 2020, you need to be either you peak by 2020 in the building sector, and you're at zero emissions above 2015, or you're down 15%. So that's the range you would need to be in. So we expect the developed countries to be at minus 15%, and the developing countries to just be peaking at about that time. So there's some equity built into this. And then in 2025, the developed countries down to roughly 30%, 25%. The developing countries now start to reduce and begin to implement the design strategies, the no-cost strategies. And then that moves out as a reduction, again, within a range to 2015, where we expect the developed countries to be carbon neutral in their building sector. This is the entire building sector. And the developing countries getting there, and then by 2055, everyone is carbon neutral. So how do we do that? What we say is new buildings. If you're going to build a new building, your budget is 70% of what an existing average building is. And you can get down at no cost to that level, and then that increases to carbon neutral by 2030 for new building design. New buildings and major renovations where you tear the whole building, practically gut it out and rebuild it new. And for existing buildings, what we say is that developed countries should renovate 2 to 3% of their building stock each year to a 50% reduction, roughly. So we start getting at the building stock, and we do that annually, and then developing countries, much less, and some of the financing needs to go from here to here to help them get to this stage. 1.5 to 2% of their building stock should be renovated each year to about a 50% reduction, so that these are programs that are put in place. If we do that, this is where the building sector will be right at the signing of the accord. You can see it's going up. About 70% of what the building sector uses is fossil fuel emitting energy, and the rest is obviously cleaner energy. If we implement those targets, those two targets, new buildings and then the renovation targets, what happens is the building sector starts on a track down, roughly, this is the global building sector, roughly 1.25% a year. And then you see the rest has to be made up by non-CO2 emitting energy. So what's existing is roughly 30%, and then you need to a little over double that. If you put the efficiency gains in, and you do the renovations to the 50%, then you can make it up with non-CO2 sources. Otherwise, it's impossible. So we need to roughly double, a little more than double the amount of renewables that we have in the world today, and non-CO2 that includes other energy sources. That would get us on a 3% track. So I showed you the butterfly before. And what I'd like you to take away from this is that don't underestimate your actions. One action leads to another action. And before you know it, we're all making incredible gains and headways in the built environment and the building sector. Thank you very much.